Hello and kill her, mommy. Welcome to Best of the Rest. My name is Chris Logan, and I am joined, as always, by my unseen voyeurist co-host, Andrew Williams. How you doing, Andrew?
That makes me sound so mean and so gross. Unseen, watching from the shadows. Nah, Chris, I'm good.
Is voyeurist a word? My document is trying to maybe change it to voyeurism. Voyeuristic. My voyeuristic co-host. Here we go. You just watch me on this computer, this monitor while I record the podcast, Andrew.
Yeah.
I can't see you on your video. I just see hands.
Just see hands. Just see hands and a
Andrew, you doing good? Doing good today?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm good. We recently have both been on airplanes. We discussed this a little bit last week. Curious, though, something we haven't talked about, you and I, is did you watch any movies on the plane? Do you typically watch a movie during a flight?
It depends. In this case, yes. On the way down, no. On the way back, I watched Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, just because I just recently got the Steelbook, so I had the digital version of it. So naturally, I got the physical copy, put it on the shelf, redeemed the digital code, and watched it digitally.
As you do,
But on the way down, I actually watched some episodes of a British panel show we watched called Taskmaster. I don't know if I've mentioned it before.
Yeah.
I was like, I wasn't, all the movies I downloaded, of course, I just was like, I'm not really feeling this.
So you always prep by downloading several movies, assuming you'll just decide on the plane what you're in the mood for?
Yeah, basically. Like, I download like 8 or 10. If I had had Fall Guy by that point, I probably would have watched that, but I hadn't have it digitally yet, so.
Did you say 8 or 10 movies?
Yeah.
So you just have no idea how you're going to feel on the plane. Do you make it a variety? Do you do like a comedy and action?
Oh yeah. You got to change it up. The Nice Guys is usually always one that's downloaded just in case. Great plane viewing, The Nice Guys. But that one's there. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, a little of the Shane Blacks. There's always something like a Spotlight or a Founder or something, some Keaton nonfiction type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, variety is the spice of life, man.
I've started leaning towards documentaries on a plane. I think I shared this on the pod before, but on the plane ride, I don't know, to Philadelphia, where was it going? I don't remember. Some plane ride I did recently. I watched My Own Private Idaho because it's available on, the headrest little TV provided by United. I'm like, you know what? This is in the Criterion Collection. It's early Keanu Reeves. It's River Phoenix is like widely considered his best role. So I watched it. It was good, really good movie. Lots of graphic scenes in that movie, very, very graphic, and it's so awkward watching that on a plane, especially when it's on the headrest. Like I can't. It's not like my phone. I can kind of put it in my lap or whatever, but. At the same time, I'm like, well, I didn't decide for this movie to be available here. Like, you guys provided it to me. I can't feel too bad, but it was pretty awkward. So, on my way on the plane ride to Philadelphia, heading to WrestleMania, I don't know if I shared this on the podcast, but I watched the Bray Wyatt documentary.
Oh no!
Who, for those who may not know, was a WWE wrestler who tragically passed away way, way too young. And this documentary came out less than a full year after his death, and I figured I'd watch that on the plane. I'm going to WrestleMania. I was going to see a panel about this documentary, so I want to make sure I saw the documentary first. And it's just kind of a safe choice for an airplane, I think. A documentary, it's a lot of talking heads, just depending on the subject matter. You can probably watch it without feeling too uncomfortable. So I watched that on my phone. I bawled like a baby. It's a tough watch, especially if you're a fan, but it's a tough watch no matter what. But my most recent flights here, I mentioned that we went to Florida, went to Universal Studios for family vacation. I downloaded 3 movies, and 2 were documentaries. I downloaded The People versus George Lucas, which I've been meaning to watch for a long time. I downloaded Conan O'Brien Can't Stop, which is the documentary about his tour he did when he was not allowed to appear on television after he lost the Tonight Show. And I downloaded Shin Godzilla. That was my attempt to have a little bit of variety. Godzilla movie I've always heard is awesome. I never get to watch. So all 3 of those movies I got to watch recently. I think the first one I watched was Conan O'Brien. Big fan of Conan. Been meaning to watch that documentary. It's very good. It's very funny. Highly recommend. I finally watched The People versus George Lucas, Andrew. Now, this is a documentary about the Star Wars fandom and their feelings towards its creator, George Lucas. A man that obviously they have to hold in some kind of high regard because he creates Star Wars, but also they have a lot of problems with things that he's done. And here's my big takeaway here. I agree with just about every point, every grievance these fans have. Like, I agree the original versions of Star Wars should be commercially available. And it's crazy that they aren't, and even a bit hypocritical based on things that George Lucas himself has said. I agree that the changes in the special editions are not for the better. I agree that the prequels, look, I'm sure we'll talk about it on this podcast one day, but there's sort of this hand wave of like, well, Star Wars is for children. You've just gotten older. That's a valid point, but I think there's also some quality issues happening there. So those are the main points of this documentary. While I simultaneously agree with these fans, I watch them and I go, you are such a nerd. And boy, please go touch some grass. Just the vulgarity, how much they genuinely get angry, how much they use terms like what has happened to their childhood, the phrase that I don't like repeating, like how much they liberally use that stuff. And I'm just, I watch them like, God, I guess I'm on your side, but the way it affects your life is pretty extreme. And I didn't see Star Wars in the late 70s when it came out. I wasn't a kid then. I'm probably not as big a fan of them, so maybe that explains in part why they're more passionate, but I have a hard time thinking about franchises I am passionate about and try to put myself in their shoes. Like, I don't know if I would ever let these things affect me this extremely, but entertaining documentary nonetheless.
I get there's an age-old saying. It's not age-old, but it's you're right. You're just wrong about why you're right. And I think that kind of applies a little bit. Or at the same time, you can have a point and be making that point in a very wrong, gross kind of way.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also what's so interesting to me about people that like hate the Disney Star Wars, where they're like, Disney doesn't know what to do with this. They've just turned it into a brand. They're just trying to blah, 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 blah. They're just trying to do it. And it's like, you all said every single one of these things when the prequels were released. Like, you guys haven't enjoyed anything Star Wars has done since Return of the Jedi and maybe the Clone Wars TV show. Like, they don't like the prequels. They don't like the Disney stuff. They don't like anything. Yeah. And it led to the age-old saying of no one hates Star Wars more than Star Wars fans, because they can't seem to not... the amount of things Star Wars that match the vision of Star Wars in their head are now just almost minuscule compared to what the rest of it is. And like you said, it's not so much that you dislike it. You're allowed to dislike it. You can even have, passionate points about it. But the whole issue I had with that documentary was specifically that I was just like, are you guys okay? Like, you guys are like, there's this, like you said, it's like this disconnect. Like, there's a point at which your displeasure has led to it becoming almost this defining part of your personality. And I'm just like, dude, like, I like lots of things, but like, I've moved on from a lot of it. Like, I was actually, oddly, I saw this clip with Kevin Smith that just popped up on like my TikTok or my Instagram reels or something. And it was him on Michael Rosenbaum's podcast, I think. And he was talking to me. He's like, there used to be a time where, Kevin Smith telling you how much he disliked something for 30 minutes was like a thing. where you could find a video of Kevin Smith telling you all about why this thing was dumb. And he's like, dude, I just don't do that anymore. And he was like, you're going to find me talking about the stuff that I like, and you're going to listen to me like, you want me to talk 30 minutes about something that I passionately enjoy. I got you. But he was like, what changed? He was like, well, one, I had the massive heart attack. And like last year, he actually had like a mental health crisis. And so he's like, there's not enough time to just be upset about stuff anymore. Like there's just not.
Yeah.
Like I would much rather spend that time enjoying things and talking about the things I love than going endlessly about, man, this sucks. And here's, a bullet pointed 8-point list of why. And I just don't. I've largely tried to occupy a similar space where I'm mostly live and let live about people enjoying things that I don't like. And if I don't like something, it's fine. And I'm not saying I'll never say I don't like something. Like I saw Madam Web, which I'm sure is staring us down the end of a barrel one day. But but at the same time, like, I just don't have the energy. I personally just don't have the energy to like dedicate to being like, oh, here's why I hate this and why it's stupid and why it kind of sucks.
And I don't like who
cares
what it does to you. Like if you go on this rant about a thing you hate, you are in a bad headspace. You're focusing on something that doesn't bring you joy, so you're not going to feel happy while you're doing it. Versus you focus on the things you like and positives and celebrate, you're just going to feel better about it. And it's better to listen to. I mean, it's honestly the cornerstone of our podcast. It's like baked into our premise. It's the whole reason we wanted to do a hashtag positivity podcast. There's enough negativity being put out there. Let's put out some positive, et cetera, et cetera. You've heard this spiel. But I also want to always caveat these things with like, I don't want to sound like I'm on a soapbox or being holier than thou when I talk about this documentary and these nerds. Certainly there was times in my life, like if my life had been recorded, you could throw a clip here right now of me going on some rant that makes me look like the biggest hypocrite. But I just like to think that I've grown and matured and put in some effort to make some changes and realize these things. So, I'm not saying I'm better than anybody, but at this point in my life, looking at people put that much energy into a thing they hate, it can be tough. And then Shin Godzilla, I got to watch just half of that on the plane, and then I finished the other half at home. But
it rules.
I haven't seen -1, so I'll say Shin Godzilla is maybe the best Godzilla movie I've seen. The original's great for historical reasons and everything. But as far as like, if I'm gonna put one on and enjoy the ride, I think Shin Godzilla might be my new number one. But I've got to see -1. The Steelbook went up on Target for pre-order, and it was within an hour. It said sold out, and then it's been delisted. So I think that was some kind of mistake. But I'm hitting refresh every now and then. I'm trying to nail that thing down so I can finally get a copy and check it out.
Yeah, because I want an American version too, because like I know like the Godzilla store like did an exclusive Steelbook or something in their shop, and like. It was literally
the 4-disc edition that they released in Japan, and then they're finally touting this as like the U.S. release. But the special features don't have English subtitles, and the literature is in Japan or in
they
Japanese.
Literally, I guarantee you, all they did was they just grabbed an English subtitle file, told the exact same manufacturer in Japan, just add this English subtitle file, and then they're sending that thing out.
Yes,
I guarantee you that's what it is. And don't get me wrong, cool. Like, you're making the movie available, but, like, the movie's already on Netflix with English subtitles. You can watch it that way. And so it's just one of those things where I was like, I appreciate what you're doing, but I don't want to pay for...
Call me crazy, but if I spend $60 on a movie, I want to be able to enjoy all the content that's being offered.
You're literally... And in that case, I would literally be like, sell a bare bones 4K disc for $25. Or sell a combo pack for $30 or $35. Like, don't sell me a fancy collector's edition where I can partake in none of the collector's edition stuff. Call me crazy.
Yeah. So one day, from what I've gathered, -1 will probably be my new favorite. But Shin Godzilla was really good. It rules. I liked it a lot.
Pretty good.
It's like a political thriller, which is what I loved about it. Like, the key to a Godzilla movie, you know what you're getting with the Godzilla scenes, but like, what do they do with the human scenes? And I liked all the choices they made with the human aspect of that movie, Andrew. Speaking of historically important films, though, we've got quite the movie on the docket today. Each week, we take a second look at a movie that was poorly received upon release and challenge ourselves to only talk about the things we like and what the movie does well. It is summer camp month, and this week we're talking the 1980 film Friday the 13th. Andrew, what is your history with this movie? I guess the franchise as a whole, but the OG. What's your history with the film?
Not familiar.
Never heard of it, huh?
No, yeah, just brand new. Definitely never reviewed any of these on the podcast before, so no clue. But no, I mean, this is that thing that, like, growing up, like, I heard about, but my parents didn't want me to watch. They were like, oh, you know, those are gory, they're nasty, they're evil characters, whatever. Now it's weird going back and looking at my childhood and seeing just how, like, my parents just don't care about that sort of stuff now. Like, they just, like, all of the things they were like, don't do this, don't watch this. Now it's just like, whatever.
Man, trust me, as someone, you know, I've talked about I have 9 siblings before, right? I have parents that have remarried and had more kids, so there's some large age gaps. Watching these kids grow up and the things they can get away with that I never could, including some of the content they get to watch, just makes me sit back and go, huh, all right, let's see how it is.
I accepted a long time ago that my parents at this point in their lives are basically like, we tried. So they're just kind of content. They're just kind of content to be like, do whatever.
We put all that effort into the first few, and look how they turned out.
Yeah. Makes you feel good. But at some point though, when I was in high school, college, I started going and watching these. And ended up kind of developing a bit of a love for the franchise, just because I think it's a really weird thing. We've mentioned before how it just seems really strange that they've never come back to this. I mean, we talked about this on Jason X. So, I mean, we've kind of gone through this a little bit before. But it is interesting going back to the original. I have not watched the original in a really long time. I wouldn't say it's my favorite of the franchise. But, so it's been around. And, like, obviously, you know, went back, watched it a whole bunch. Used to have... No, I've never bought a box set of this one. I had a Nightmare on Elm Street set, and I had the Halloween set when it came out. I never had a Friday the 13th set. I don't know why.
They did was it Shout or Arrow that did the box set?
It's still out there.
Is it still in
still
print?
Out there.
Well, they brought in...
It is.
Because it's includes 9 and 10, which is what's crazy, because those are made by different studios. But when they're all together, it makes a huge mural.
Well, they sell it in a box set now, I think. Because I was looking, and I was actually shocked that it was still available, because, like, the Halloween box set is long out of print.
Man, if this is legit still available, I might be picking it up.
It is on Amazon right now for $130. But you know, it's a gnarly set. And I'm actually shocked that it's still in print. Well, because the Halloween box set was similar. It was the shock that, because, like, as some of the Halloween movies are owned by different studios as well, so people were kind of like, how can you put them all in one box set? The only way to do it is if a third party basically goes to everybody and says, hey, we'd like to license this. Basically, all the studios have to play ball. And for the longest time, that was a thing that they wouldn't do. Like, somebody would be like, hey, we want to do a box set of all the Halloween movies. Can we get licensed to yours? And they would be like, no, we have no interest in that. So, like, Halloween's interesting because, like, there's 4Ks now of almost all of the originals, but Shout hasn't done a box set of them. They sell them all individually, and then they sell 6, H2O, and Resurrection.
It's weird those three are always grouped together.
They're
the end of one trilogy and the beginning of a new series.
I think those are all the ones that Dimension Miramax releases, which is weird to me that Shout would release it that way. Like, I understand why they would release it that way. They would be like, oh, these are the 3 we have rights to, here you go.
Well, it's probably the only way you're going to sell 6 and 8, is if you put it with
I don't
H2O.
know. Well, 6, I think, yeah, it's possibly true. I gotta one day decide if I'm going to finish that set in 4K or not. I have 1, 2, and 3 in 4K. I haven't done any of the others, so I would need to do 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then I think I would. And then I do have the new trilogy in 4K as well.
You're going to finish the set. We all know you are, Andrew. And I'm probably going to buy this box set because I'm not responsible. But hey, We're not talking about Halloween or box sets. We're talking about the original Friday the 13th, the movie that was released May 9th of 1980, made on a budget of $550,000. Incredible. At the box office, it brings in $59.8 million. That is a smash hit when you consider that budget. Critically, well, today it holds a 66% on Rotten Tomatoes. You look at it's only 58 reviews, and they are pretty much none of them are historical reviews. It's a lot of revisions or reviews of DVDs and re-releases, and at that point you're taking in like historical significance and, you know, what it launched and the franchise. But when this movie released in 1980, it was not a franchise. It was not the beginning of some great legacy. It was not the beginning of Jason Voorhees, as we all know. We've seen Scream. He's not the killer here. Like many of the hallmarks of the franchise are not present in this initial one. But let me be clear with you. This movie was not well received upon release critically. It made a lot of money. Teenagers went and saw it. It spawned a franchise. We know all of this, but it is not Halloween, right? Which Halloween comes out a couple years before this. That is well received. That is considered a groundbreaking film. We'll get into production a little bit in a minute, but Friday the 13th was like, hey, Halloween made a lot of money. Let's make one of those. I mean, that is like the origin of this movie. So I dug back. I went on a website I've talked about here many times before, mrque.com, Movie Review Query Engine. It's a great way to search for historical reviews. I found this one published in Variety, December 31st, 1979. The review is so short, I'm just going to read it to you in its entirety. It says, low budget in the worst sense, with no apparent talent or intelligence to offset its technical inadequacies. Friday the 13th has nothing to exploit but its title.
Woof.
Another teenager in Jeopardy entry contrived to lure the profitable Halloween audience. This one is set in a crumbling New Jersey summer camp, shuttered for 20 years after a history of accidental deaths and other spooky stuff, and about to be reopened for the summer. 6 would-be counselors arrive to get the place ready, then are progressively dispatched by knife, hatchet, spear, and arrow. Producer-director Sean S. Cunningham telegraphs the 6 murders too far ahead to keep anyone in even vague suspense, and without building a modicum of tension in between. Andrew, there's not a single positive word in that review.
That is brutal.
This is trash. It's derivative. It's a cheap cash-in, and that was the critical reception through and through. There wasn't even, I couldn't find a single example of someone that's like, you know what, there's something here. Because even when you pull back, you know, I've talked a little bit about historical significance. The only historical significance is the fact that this spawned a franchise. I can't say that it's, you know, even huge fans of the franchise typically don't cite this one as the high point of the franchise or the best one. I wanted to get a Roger Ebert review, but he did not review the original. However, he did review part 2. And at first I was like, well, I'm not going to include that here because that's kind of unfair to be like, look what he thought of this one. Until I read the review and the last line of the review. So here's an excerpt from Roger Ebert's review for part 2 from January 1st, 1981. Crazy how fast they turned this around. Here's how it ends. He says, this movie is a cross between the mad slasher and dead teenager genres. About 24 movies a year feature a mad killer going berserk, and they're all about as bad as this one. Some have a little more plot, some have a little less. It doesn't matter. Sinking into my seat in this movie theater from my childhood, I remembered the movie fantasies when I was a kid. They involved teenagers who fell in love, made out with each other, customized their cars, listened to rock and roll, and were rebels without causes. Neither the kids in those movies nor the kids watching them would have understood a worldview in which the primary function of teenagers is to be hacked to death. Last line, he puts an asterisk. This review will suffice for the Friday the 13th film of your choice. Basically, cut and paste my review. These are my thoughts of every single movie in this franchise. And he does that with part 2. Little did he know how many more of these they would make. But even at that time, there were so many slashers and knockoffs, and it was, you know, it was
I mean, Prom Night comes out the same year as this. I was curious because you mentioned did Ebert review this? Gene Siskel did review this, you know, Siskel and Ebert, but he hated it.
Yeah.
He loathed this. His review first off, he spoils it in the first 3 paragraphs and then literally says, "Now there, I hope I've ruined this for you."
That's such a dick move.
He literally says, "I hope I've ruined Friday the 13th, which is the latest film by one of the most despicable creatures ever to infest the movie business, Sean S. Cunningham. You may have heard of one of his other films, The Last House on the Left, a film in which a teenage girl is forced at gunpoint." Okay, we're not going to say that out loud. He does say at one point, he's like, "I'm shocked Paramount Pictures released this. It's odd to see a major publicly held film company handle a movie as bloody as this. Paramount is a division of Gulf and Western Industries. If you want to complain about the film, you can write Charles G. Bloodhorn, the chairman of the board of Gulf and Western, at 1 Gulf and Western Plaza, New York, 1023. Yeah, he hated this. Absolutely loathed it. There apparently is an At the Movies segment. Oh no, that's the 4th one. But yeah, my God. Yeah. So those are clearly the historical reviews. They did not enjoy this. They thought it was bad.
So if you saw this pop up in your feed and you're like, why is Best the Rest doing the original of all the movies in this franchise? I mean, look, I think every movie in this franchise probably qualifies for our show. So we may as well start at the beginning. And like you said, we've covered Jason X and Freddy vs. Jason already. If this sort of lasts long enough, there might be an episode for every movie in this franchise. But for this month, for Summer Camp Month, it just made sense to start at the beginning. A movie that is firmly set at a summer camp, which continues, you know, isn't always the case as the series continues. And yeah, I mean, it was not well received. Other than that box office, not well received in its initial release. Taking a look at the creative team behind the film. It was written by Victor Miller. Now, interesting filmography here. You would expect his filmography to be filled with Friday the 13th movies. We know how many of these they made, but he actually splits from the franchise after this and just starts getting credit for the characters that this introduces. And it's a huge reason why the rights to this franchise is so complicated these days. But he does have some other film credits, nothing crazy high profile, although he is a writer on Jury Duty, the Pauly Shore movie from 1995, one that I certainly remember. Heavens. And has a pretty extensive career on television, primarily with soap operas, pretty high profile ones too, like One Life to Live, Guiding Light, and All My Children.
Yeah, it's an interesting career for sure, and I'm guessing possibly the reason he doesn't end up being more involved with the franchise is because of the television work that he starts doing not long after this. He's the associate head writer on One Life to Live from 82 to 84. He's on All My Children for various stints throughout the 80s, even into the 2000s. Guiding Light in the late 80s and the mid 90s. Associate head writer on Another World from 90 to 95. General Hospital. I mean, yeah, this dude banked writing for soap operas. He does one other film with Sean S. Cunningham, though, which I think is interesting. It's a movie called A Stranger is Watching, which is another kind of weird horror film that is kind of the first thing that they did after Friday the 13th, and it's kind of made, this is January 82, so I mean, this is coming together pretty quickly after that. That one's interesting because it has Kate Mulgrew, who would later on be Captain Janeway on Star Trek, as our lead actress. Rip Torn, the Zed from Men in Black, plays kind of the villain. It's a weird little movie. I've watched it before. It's very, very strange. But it is also, it's based off the novel by, what is that woman's name? Mary Higgins Clark, who wrote a bunch of kind of high profile thrillers in the mid to late 70s, early 80s. some of which are actually pretty scary. I'm not going to lie to you. But that one is odd because it's co-written by Earl Mac Rauch, who also wrote a movie called The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension, which is nothing like A Stranger is Watching. Absolutely nothing like it. But other than that, Victor Miller has largely stayed out of the horror genre. It is he did eventually, like you said, you mentioned it. There was a bit of a legal battle between Cunningham and Miller over who owned the rights to that original script. Cunningham's take was basically that Miller was hired as a work-for-hire thing. Basically, that became a large standing issue with the franchise, and it's arguably why nothing's happened with it to this day. But eventually, the courts ruled that, like I said, Victor Miller does have the rights to that original script. It is a odd thing because you can't really divorce the script from it. It just means that whoever wants the rights is going to have to pay Victor Miller and Sean Cunningham at that point. Because as we'll discuss, there are hallmarks of this franchise that are not present in this original film. So it's an interesting thing. But yeah, Victor Miller, near as I can tell, still out there doing his thing. Occasionally dips into some things here and there. But yeah, just a couple of horror things, and ultimately kind of sticks to soap operas, which nice work if you can get it.
The movie is directed by Sean S. Cunningham, as we've mentioned, a producer and director, although definitely more producing credits, but isn't afraid to step behind the camera and is, I think, generally considered the lead creative force of this first film. But as we just discussed, he didn't write it. Doesn't have any writing credit, so it can be a tenuous situation. What I find interesting is that he also does not continue with this franchise, despite being obviously so heavily involved in the creation of it. Instead, as a producer, he tries to get, more and more clout in producing other horror films. He does the House series, probably the biggest thing he does after this. And you can even see it, his name starts going like above the title, even though he's just a producer on those films. Does have a producing credit for My Boyfriend's Back, an obscure movie from the early 90s that Andrew and I are both huge fans of, and I will recommend that to anyone listening. He does eventually find his way back to this franchise, though, but with number 9. So after the Paramount run is done, 9 is Jason Goes to Hell. Very strange film. I'm sure we'll cover on this podcast. And he remains on board with Jason X and the reboot. Now, that's just because you've got to go to this guy for the right to that point. So once it starts changing hands, he's got to start being involved again. But very strange. I mean, this franchise just has such a strange history. But yeah, really can't overstate his influence on this initial film, though.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, even before this, like I mentioned in Siskel's review, but he has a producing credit on The Last House on the Left, which is the kind of debut of Wes Craven as a directing force. Wes Craven writes and directs that, but Sean Cunningham is the one who kind of brings it to fruition, and then kind of, like you said, does kind of his own stuff, but then, like you said, definitively hits gold with Friday the 13th. But like you said, oddly does not stick around that franchise. He directs a good run of stuff in the immediate aftermath of this, none of which is none of it's like trying to do the other thing. He does A Stranger is Watching, I mentioned, which is an adaptation of a book. He does like a weird sex comedy called Spring Break, that is just, your standard kids at the beach and spring break type nonsense. And then he does like a thriller mystery film called The New Kids, and then that's when he kind of starts doing more producing, and that's when you start getting stuff like House, the whole House series, My Boyfriend's Back, that gets you out of the 80s into the 90s. But since then, his directing credits are much more limited. It's not directing. He still does things, but just occasionally. But like I said, I think he really tried to get the producing credit up there and really tried to spread his name around, and there's definite success here. You can't deny it, even if his legacy only is Friday the 13th. But a long career that occasionally he jumps back forth and does something occasionally. But yeah.
Well, Andrew, I say that we jump into it, dive into this initial entry. Maybe a lot of the hallmarks of the series aren't here, but what is here? What does this movie have to offer? What are the high points? What are the positives? We're going to talk all about it. Andrew, Friday the 13th, are you ready?
Yes.
A group of teenagers gather at the dilapidated Camp Crystal Lake to fix up the campgrounds and prepare for a grand reopening. Despite locals warning the newcomers that the camp is cursed, they continue their repair work. But on Friday night, the would-be camp counselors start getting murdered one by one by a mysterious unseen killer. That's it. That covers it, right? That's the plot we have going on here.
Yep.
Let's just jump in, Andrew. But before we get to the scenes, of course, we got to talk about this cast, and we're gonna start with the high point: best casting, best performance of the film. Because every episode we recognize what a person who goes so far above and beyond the call of duty that they actually elevate the quality of the entire film with their performance. And we recognize that person by giving them the Mark Strong Award. So, Andrew, kick us off here. Who is getting a Mark Strong Award for Friday the 13th?
I think you got to go straight to the top in this case, Chris, and you got to go with Betsy Palmer as Pamela Voorhees. Mrs. Voorhees. Is she called Pamela here? I don't know if she is or not. She introduces herself as Mrs.
Does she say
Voorhees.
Mrs. Voorhees? Yeah. I don't know if she ever.
So I don't know. Yeah, that's an interesting. I don't know if I did that. Yeah, the main first film where she's only known as Mrs. Voorhees. Yeah, gnarly. Cool. So anyway, she plays the villain of this film, unseen for the first 2/3 or so. She's around for a good bit at the end. The cat and mouse chase at the end of this movie does go for a very long time.
Yes, it does.
But she is revealed initially as only Mrs. Voorhees. She introduced herself as a friend of the guy kind of restoring the camp. She initially trusts her, but then that she gives this big exposition dump of basically what it is, who she is, what she's doing, and like gives us clues on what the flashback to 1958 was, and is just really dialing into this kind of woman that has gone unhinged since her son's death. She even says at one point, she's like, I am Jason, kind of revealing that like her mind is kind of split and Jason occupies half of it or something like that. Or at least there's a thing she's doing there similar to kind of a psycho type thing. But she is really unhinged in this last act of this film, and she is giving it everything she's got. I mean, Betsy Palmer was rest in peace, was just look at her filmography. There's a big run in the late 50s, kind of stops for a little bit, and then kind of starts doing some bit parts throughout the 80s into the 90s and the 2000s. But she gives it all here, and the movie is better for having her in it.
Andrew, I'm agreeing with you 100%. Betsy Palmer's got to be getting the Mark Strong Award here. The idea of the Mark Strong Award is like one performance that adds that special oomph to the movie that elevates it. It really makes a difference. And the writing really sets up for this performance to be that secret sauce of the movie. And Betsy Palmer delivers 100%. I mean, up until then, we've basically just seen teenagers be horny teenagers, and nothing against the cast. They're all great at being horny teenagers. But This, her monologue, her split personality, the exposition, she handles it all super well. And this is definitely a bit of stunt casting. And I think the effect of that can't be appreciated by you and I, Andrew, who are not alive in 1980. We're coming to this after the fact, but seeing this in theaters, like, she was a recognizable star. Maybe not A-list, not a movie star, but a known commodity, been in the business for years, had high-profile stuff, appeared in, like, game shows of the time as herself. She's like that level of celebrity. So I'm thinking like who would be if they tried to do this now and like boom, the killer is, I don't know, Marcia Gay Harden,
Wayne Brady,
Wayne Brady, sure, yeah, yeah. It's that again, not like it's not the fact that it's a huge star, but it's a known actor showing up as the killer of your slasher. It's the coolest thing this movie has to offer. It's weird. It's the big hook of this movie, but obviously you can't do that every entry, so it doesn't become a hallmark of the series, and the series finds all new hallmarks to make as part of its canon. But it's definitely the big hook here, and I think she does a great job. I mean, a lot of TV credits, a lot of melodramatic stuff, and I think that leans so well to what she has to do here, doing the child's voice and really corny stuff, but I mean that in the best way. It's quite campy, but it's what makes the movie special. I mean, gosh, this movie, like I said, the entire reason it exists is producers at Paramount saw the success of Halloween and said, hey, we want to do our slasher and make some money. Make a real cheap movie, try to get a return to the box office, find a hook for a title. It's just... the origin of this movie aren't coming from the most creative place artistically, but I think they stumble onto a pretty good hook here. If there's anything that is separating this movie from the rest of the franchise or slashers of the time, it's this reveal about the killer, which I think is pretty cool. And again, just got to give it up to Betsy Palmer for making it work. Wearing what I now refer to as a ransom sweater, which becomes like a hallmark of this character. It's good. It's good stuff. She's great. I mean, this was a pretty slam dunk of a Mark Strong award, in my opinion. Yeah. It is a good performance, but mainly just because of like what this character is and what the twist means to the movie. Like, I think this is the difference maker.
She's also just given... She's just given so much more than everybody else. Like you said, everybody's doing a great job at being a horny teenager, which is all they're really expected to do. But when the chips are down, there's really only one other character that kind of gets the focus that she does, and I'm sure we're about to talk about her in a second. But she's really the only one given any development, any kind of history, any kind of information, even. Like, we don't really know who any of these other characters are.
Yeah.
We don't know who they were before they came to the camp. They don't really have any arcs they undergo while they're at the camp, which is by no means a problem. I mean, this is hardly the first or last slasher movie where a bunch of side characters have no development. I mean, Halloween, you really think of all the characters in Halloween that have development, there ain't a whole lot of them. It's kind of Michael, Laurie, and Loomis, and that's really your core there. So it's hardly by any means unusual for it to be like that. But as a result, it kind of means that the characters that get more to play with are naturally going to be the ones that stand out a little bit more. And in this case, Betsy Palmer stands way above everybody else.
Adrienne King plays Alice, our final girl, as it were, of the film. And true to the hallmarks of this genre, for most of the movie, she is just one of the teenagers, but slowly as the others drop off, she's the one that gets to have the final showdown with the villain and be our survivor. So I think this is what you're alluding to, where there's someone else that gets a little bit more than most of the cast, and that is Adrienne King, who does a great job. I mean, when you talk about this performance, you immediately go to her final face-offs with Betsy Palmer as Mrs. Voorhees. She's able to hold her own, skate by, survive, and eventually get the killing blow. What are you looking for in a final girl? Someone who can scream and look terrified, but believably stand up to the killer when it's time. And she does all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've talked about Adrienne King before. I don't remember why. Probably when we were talking about Friday the 13th at some other capacity. But it's an interesting story because she is brought back for Friday the 13th Part 2, but she dies like immediately. Sorry, spoilers, folks.
Something that I believe she was not aware of till like she was on set. Like, right. Oh yeah, we're just killing you off, which is such a weird thing to do to your final girl.
Well, it is. It was so weird. There was a lot of not great communication regarding that second film. She, like I said, she assumed she was going to be the star of the film, basically, and then they were kind of like shocked her with this death and didn't really show her the script. And she was dealing with like a really bad stalker at the time. Like in the success of the first film, she was dealing with stalking. So like you strand this woman basically in the middle of nowhere at this hotel who's being stalked after finding out she's being killed immediately in this film. It's just not great treatment.
Yeah.
And I don't really like it. And she didn't really either. She does appear, like I said, in Friday the 13th Part 2, then largely shifts out of acting for a good long while, actually gets into stuff like stunt performing and even voice looping. Does stunt performing stuff on movies like Ghostbusters, does voice looping on stuff like Philadelphia, While You Were Sleeping, Jerry Maguire, Titanic, Mouse Hunt, gets into that side of the technical things, and then eventually does find her way back into some kind of bit parts with acting. Even did a Friday the 13th fan film a couple years ago where she reprised her role as Alice Hardy, because I guess if you kickstart your film and you make enough money, you can pay real actors to be in them. And then kind of embraced it a little bit more. And then apparently she was supposed to be involved with this originally titled Crystal Lake Friday the 13th prequel show that Brian Fuller was doing with A24. I don't know how, since it's supposed to be a prequel, but that thing's all kind of up in limbo now. But she also did do the audiobook for one of my favorite books recently, The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. Because he really said... Cool. It's that book was kind of born out of him reading that story about her regarding Friday the 13th Part 2. And so his kind of envision for Final Girl Support Group was, what does adult, aged, grown Alice Hardy actually look like? How do we give her an ending that's better than the one she actually got? I wouldn't go as far as to say that, Final Girl Support Group is just Friday the 13th fan fiction or anything, but I think the idea that some of these Final Girls back in the day didn't quite get maybe the ending they deserved, definitely forms a foundational part of that book, and I actually really do love that book, so I highly recommend it to anybody. It's not to be confused with Final Girls, the book by Riley Sager, which has a similar concept, but both are really good, but I really do like Final Girl Support Group. I like anything by Grady Hendrix, but that one, if you're a slasher fan, is particularly good. No further notes.
Now, Andrew, I'm going to be honest with everybody here. I just rewatched this movie, right? I'm familiar with it. I've seen it. I'm probably going to have a hard time going through one by one these teenagers and remembering exactly what their character did, but I'll try to go through the ones that really stand out, and then maybe together we can cull together some positive say about each of them. But let's just jump to Kevin Bacon as Jack, because obviously the most high profile actor in this movie, at least in retrospect. This is his first film, so he was just another kid at the time, but he goes on to be Kevin Bacon. Yes. I can't say that there's anything he's doing here necessarily where you'll look at him and be like, you know what, this kid's going to be a star, other than just he's a good-looking kid. But does have some memorable scenes. This movie is not, despite being horny teenagers, not filled with sex, but he does get to be part of the one sex scene that is here, and a pretty memorable death. But I think my favorite thing that he does is joke around with the cop, who none of them take very seriously, mouths off to him, starts messing with his motorcycle. Just seems like a real punk kid, like the rest of them. But, gosh, it's Kevin Bacon. Alum of the show. We talked about him multiple times now. He showed up at R.I.P.D. We covered Stir of Echoes. He's probably a Mark Strong Award winner, but as we know, there's no way for us to check. But Kevin Bacon, one of my personal favorites, and his career reminds me a bit of Michael Keaton's, but he's missing that revival. We need a high-profile, dramatic Kevin Bacon role. Put him back in the A-list. I think the world is due, Andrew. What do you think?
I'd be down for it. Which is weird because I just saw him in 2 new movies that just came out this year, so I can't really say that.
He's still working. He's doing, his career's fine, but he's certainly not. When we covered R.A.P.D., he was just the random villain. He's not even on the poster, I think. That's kind of like the place that he's kind of settled into is late in his career.
Yeah. He was one of the corrupt cops in Beverly Hills Cop Axel F, the recent Beverly Hills Cop 4. He shows up there. It's not a spoiler. The minute you look at him, he's a bad cop. And then I actually did just see him in Maxine, the 3rd installment of the X trilogy from Ty West. He plays John Labatt, a Louisiana private investigator, and my God, he is relishing in being the greasy, sweaty, nasty Southern private eye. He's leaning into it completely, and I'm watching that, and I'm like, one, he loved playing this character because he just gets to be so gross, but two, again, you just get reminded that like Kevin Bacon's pretty good at that acting thing. So yeah. I'm down for more Kevin Bacon, but I
gotta check that out. I haven't seen any movies in that trilogy. Let me ask: is it a story narrative trilogy, or is it like a spiritual trilogy of films? These X films,
they follow the same characters in a way. So you definitely want to see X before seeing Maxine. Pearl is not inherently needed because Pearl is actually a prequel to X. So it's odd in that way, but X. Like, Maxine, the Maxine of Maxine, is a lead character in X as well. So, knowing the events of X are definitely important to knowing what's happening in Maxine. Pearl, I think, is just Pearl might actually, like, pound for pound, be the best movie of the trilogy. But Maxine has the rule of cool in effect for it. Everything happening in it just looks so cool. It works. It's probably my favorite just because we're doing kind of the faceless killer with black gloves, which means you're a giallo movie because killer with black gloves, that's what it means. Yeah, worth watching. Definitely would check them out.
Got it.
Kevin Bacon, the thing that's actually notable, I would say it's actually decently notable for this, the way he dies is actually done by a gentleman named Tom Savini, who would go on to become a very, very noted monster effects artist.
Yes.
Directed the Night of the Living Dead remake, has done endless amounts of things. You can look up Tom Savini and see. He's responsible for how they pulled off. Go ahead.
I just want to say, if you've seen Grindhouse, if you've seen Planet Terror, Robert Rodriguez cast Tom Savini as a character there. So if you've seen that movie, you know what this guy looks like. He gets torn, he gets quartered. He gets torn into four in that movie in a very cool way. But I thought that was very cool to make him a character in that movie.
So basically, I actually love it. So Kevin Bacon's death, he basically takes an arrow through the neck from the back from beneath a bed. It's gnarly. And I even watching it, because his face is moving when it happens.
Yeah.
And I was
so
like,
cool.
How are they doing this? And so it turns out it's, they did a body cast of Kevin Bacon and then stuck his head through the mattress. And then under the bed, Savini and his assistant attached a blood bag to a tube, and they pushed the arrowhead through, and somebody else did the blood bag. And then they had a whole bunch of different things, and they had, the ultimate effect. It looks awesome, and it's just Kevin Bacon's face, like, sitting through the cast, and I was like, man, that's creative. That is really, really great. It's a great effect, and this apparently was a big thing that started getting Tom Savini a little bit more attention, even though I think he'd already kind of been pretty established by this point. But it's definitely a cool death, and one of the few. There's not that many deaths in this movie, but several of them are off screen, basically. This is one we definitely see when it happens up close, and they make it look good.
Yeah, and it's very cool, and also, I wish there was more of it. They put so much effect into it, but it's only on screen for a few seconds, and that becomes, if there's anything that's a hallmark of the series that starts here, it's definitely the censorship. These movies get cut to hell and toned down so much for the theaters, and then, in most cases, never get re-released in their full glory. There is an uncut version of this movie. It's less than a minute longer. I don't know how much it actually is able to add back in, but there's so much cool deaths and gory stuff in the series that you just have to, like, read about and can never actually get to see. It kind of sucks.
Right.
All right, Andrew, looking at these teenagers, I want to talk about Robbie Morgan as Annie. Because this is a cool little trick this movie does, is we're setting up Robbie to be maybe the main teenager, maybe the final girl, if you know how these things work. We get to see her arrive in town, meet the locals, meet Ralph, who's the crazy guy that warns everybody about everything. She hitches a ride to the camp, but in a little twist, she never makes it to the campground. She's picked up by another unseen hitchhiker, who clearly is not going to stop to let her out. She's got to jump from the car and make a run for it, but the driver, I should say, catches up to her in the woods, slits her throat. Another pretty cool special effect. She's standing there with blood coming out of her throat. and then we fade to white in a very strange choice there. But and then she's killed, and like she never makes it to the camp. No one knows she's killed until way later in the movie. They mention her offhand. Well, Annie never showed up. She was supposed to be our cook, but I really like her plucky, happy-go-lucky attitude. She's just smiling and chipper, even though everybody in this town is super dour and clearly isn't happy about this campground getting reopened. But she is just super positive and optimistic. Pays the ultimate price for it, but I thought she really popped, and I thought it was again a bit of a twist to have her get killed the way that she does.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. Well, also I was surprised that somebody that would like travel, like she was like 20 miles from Grand Crystal Lake at the beginning of this movie. It's like, did you not know where you were going? Did you not make sure that like you were getting dropped off at the place you needed to be? But I'm watching the movie wrong. I get it, but it's interesting because, like you said, you would assume this is going to be our lead character. And she's not. She is, in fact, supposed to be the cook, and then she meets a very grisly end that we are confirmed of later when it turns out she is still seat-buckled in the front of Pamela Voorhees' Jeep. There apparently was a comic book series called Friday the 13th, Pamela's Tale, that expands on this conversation and this between them in the car and just has kind of it just fleshes that out a little bit, and it's not just reveals that it wasn't just Annie sitting there talking to herself the whole time, right. But largely just adds to the film. Eventually Annie realizes that not all is right here and needs to get out, and then she does, and she is hunted down, and you do see her die as well. Her throat is slit with a knife. You do witness that up close. Another one of the deaths we witness. But it's pretty brutal and a good little fake out, maybe, if you were expecting this person to be our lead character.
We have Mark Nelson as Ned, and he's playing a archetype of the genre. He's the funny guy. Andrew, he's playing pranks, he's making jokes, doesn't take anything seriously. You know he's gonna die. These people never make it out, but he is one of our unseen kills. We get revealed again during the sex scene with Kevin Bacon. It pans up, and he's actually already dead on the bunk above them. It's pretty interesting how often this movie sacrifices a chance to show a kill for a reveal like this. Like, it's pretty creepy to show his dead body there, but we never see him get killed. Whereas as this franchise goes on, and in most slashers, you want every chance you get to show a kill on screen. This one actually avoids it a lot, but he's good as the funny man. He's grating as they tend to be, but there's
I wasn't sad when he died, Chris.
Yeah, that's the best way to put it. I mean, this series would go on to have much quote unquote worse funny guys that really get on your nerves. He's just he's I don't know, he's like the Cartman of the group. Like, they all find him kind of annoying, but just put up with him. He fakes drowning at one point just so he can get mouth to mouth. What a classic teen movie move.
The Sandlot. 12 years before the Sandlot was a thing.
That's right. Funny guy. Now it's going to start to get tougher, Andrew, hashtag PP, to remember some specifics from these characters. Harry Crosby plays Bill, and I think Bill's the guy that's like maybe the most handy, the most capable. He knows how to work the generator. Yes. Another death off screen. We just see his body pinned to a door with a bunch of arrows through it. I'm very curious how that went down, honestly. But he's good. I don't know if you had to call him like a leader of the group, but again, he's kind of just the more
seems the most mature, maybe
handy guy, most
like
mature.
Like definitely the one who kind of has sort of a handle on everything that's going on. Obviously, he was looking at the generator. I don't know if he was supposed to be like the handyman or something, but I mean, his body is pretty brutal, but all we see him do is go out to look at the generator during one of the storms when they're having trouble and they lose power, and he does not return from that. And it's pretty gnarly.
Harry did retire from acting and got into investment banking in the mid-'80s, and has apparently been very successful in that career. And man, you've got to have the best icebreaker for any of your big investment meetings, being the guy that was in the original Friday the 13th. I wonder if he uses these stories very often at, conferences or whatever, but Good for him. What a career.
Yep.
Andrew, we got a few more teens here. Let's see. Janine Taylor plays Marcy. Marcy. Which one is Marcy? Help me out.
Marcy is the one that, okay. She's the one that has sex with Kevin Bacon.
There it is. Okay.
And then goes to the bathroom afterwards and thinks she's getting pranked. Quotes somebody, I can't remember what
in the
she
mirror.
Quotes the movie she quotes, I think, the movie The Rainmaker. I forget exactly who she's impersonating. But yeah, she's the one that thinks there's somebody in the shower stalls, thinks she's getting pranked, thinks there's nobody there, and then she turns around and gets an axe into her face.
So that brings us to Laurie Bartram as Brenda. I think, is Brenda the one that tells people about the way she plays Monopoly? Strip Monopoly?
Yes.
Okay. I definitely remember that. Brenda, excuse me.
She's the one that goes out into the storm. Out to the archery range.
Yes. Another unseen death, right? She goes out there, the lights come on, there's clearly someone there. We don't see her again until her dead body's thrown through the window. Pretty interesting. Interesting choice. Gotta say, R.I.P. to Laurie Bartram, who had a short career in acting, but actually passed away in 2007 from pancreatic cancer. She was only 49, so very tragic, definitely too soon, but had a career in both acting and as a ballet dancer.
Rest in peace.
Andrew, that covers our teens. We did it. A few more bit parts I think we can talk about here, like Peter Brower as Steve Christie. He's the guy that's actually getting this campground back in shape to try to open it up again. He is a bit of a creep. I don't like this guy. I don't think we're supposed to like this guy. Only a few key scenes. He gets dispatched of very quickly, but he does not get dispatched
of very quickly. He disappears from the movie for a while. But
well, I mean, when his death comes, he walks up and then blah, he's dead. I mean, the death is quick. Like it's not a long, drawn out death scene. But his character gives you the ick, you know?
Yeah, he's just like, there's one scene where Alice is working on the she's putting like a gutter or something up on like a cabin, and he just says some very off color things, and I'm like, gross. But I guess maybe the idea is they're sleeping in the, I don't know. It's I don't know. Anyway.
It's very strange. It doesn't really go anywhere. Hashtag PP.
Yep.
And I guess we got to talk about Walt Gorney, Andrew, who plays Ralph, credited as Crazy Ralph. Right? This is, I guess you could say this is a hallmark of the genre. I don't know if we're really originating it here or if it's already been established, where you have that guy in town that warns you of the incoming doom, right? It gets parodied in the movie Cabin in the Woods. They stop at a gas station and he warns them not to go to the cabin in the woods. It's a big thing at Pet Cemetery. Again, hallmark of the genre. Is it starting here? I'm not quite sure. But as far as crazy people that warn you of danger, you could do a lot worse than old Walt here. The man definitely looks crazy, looks intense. I wouldn't want him wandering around. He's got two big scenes. He warns Annie whenever she's in town, and then he shows up on the campgrounds just hanging out inside the pantry, walking out and saying, you should all leave, you're all doomed, you're going to get killed. And then it happened, Andrew. So it makes you wonder, is he really that crazy after all?
He's not, because he does return in part 2 where he does definitely die. So, wasn't that crazy, was he?
And of course, R.I.P. to the actor as well. Walt Gorney passed away in 2004, the ripe old age of 91.
Pretty good run. I find it interesting that, like, Crazy Ralph at the beginning of the film, when Annie is kind of going around town looking for a ride, tells her, don't go to Camp Crystal Lake, it's cursed, blah, 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 blah. And the truck driver, Rex Everhart, is credited as the truck driver, like, dismisses him immediately. He's like, that's Crazy Ralph, blah, blah, blah. And then the minute they're in the car, the truck driver's like, yeah, you shouldn't go to Camp Crystal Lake.
Yes, he does the same thing. Kids, head full of rocks, you're not going to listen to me, but you shouldn't be opening it up.
Just the fact that just reminded me of the old Rick James. You think I'll just rub my feet on somebody's couch? I ain't gonna do that. I got a little bit more sense with that. But yeah, I rub my feet on Eddie Murphy's couch. Like, just I'm good.
Andrew, I think that definitely covers the cast of this film. We got the teens, we got the killers, we got the fodder, we got it all, right? So let's talk about the scenes of this movie. But of course, we're going to start by talking about the best scene of the film, but at the very least, our personal favorite. So, Andrew, start us off here. When is this movie firing on all cylinders? What's the best scene in Friday the 13th?
I mean, we mentioned the Kevin Bacon death, but it's not quite where I'm going to go. It's a pretty cool scene. I think I'm just going to go with our final showdown on the beach where Pamela Voorhees is finally dispatched, seemingly for good. To this point, Betsy Palmer has basically chased Adrian King's Alice around this whole campground. They've had about 3 or 4 near misses now where Alice has been able to kind of momentarily incapacitate her and run back. And the implication seems to be that here on the beach, this is going to be the final showdown. And when they go back and forth, they have a pretty big fight that ultimately ends when Alice is able to get the machete that Mrs. Voorhees has been bringing around the camp, not always using, but is able to use it and then straight up beheads Mrs. Voorhees.
It's pretty gnarly.
Knocks her head clean off. It's pretty gnarly. Obviously a really big individual with like the hands being held up in front of the headless body. I don't know if that's a real thing that your body does. I don't think so.
It's maybe my favorite shot in the movie, though. The head gets knocked off, and the hands are like grasping where the head was as it falls down out of frame.
Yeah,
it looks cool. I doubt it's realistic. Cool.
I'm sure there's no science there, but looks awesome. And just the cap of this kind of very insane rampage by this kind of aggrieved mother who has not properly processed her emotions and feelings regarding the death of her son.
A little bit of therapy could have saved a lot of lives.
To be fair, I think a lot of therapy would have needed to save the lives. But
fair enough.
Regardless, I think it's still a cool death. It's one of the coolest deaths in the movie, and it caps off the main story. We get a little bit of stuff after this that kind of teases the future, but overall, this is just when the minute the head went flying, I was like, that's cool as heck.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good pick, Andrew. I feel like this. I texted you after I watched the movie. I'm like, I always forget how long this third act is. I remember Mrs. Voorhees showing up, giving the exposition, dying on the beach, and in my head, that's like 3 minutes long. It's probably a 10-minute sequence altogether from when she shows up to when she gets killed. And I don't know if they were just like, well, we got Betsy Palmer. We want to get her as much as we can in the end. So that's why they have these little mini fights throughout the campgrounds where she gets knocked over. Alice runs out. And then they kind of go through the paces again at the next building. But the culmination of that on the beach is pretty gnarly. The beheading is very cool. One of the best special effects shots in the movie. And yeah, again, the hands grasping for the head.
Yeah.
Just a beautiful, great touch. Great pick, Andrew. My favorite scene, what I was going to pick, I'm just thinking like it's a slasher. My favorite scene is going to be the best kill, and it's Kevin Bacon's death. So I think we've talked about it extensively already, but I think Kevin Bacon getting that arrow through the neck is just such a cool, gnarly special effect. It definitely stands out. It's my favorite death in the movie. It is like 10 seconds long. If my favorite scene needs to be longer, we can include the sex scene in there. I don't know, but it's or not to be gross, but the reveal of Ned being dead in the bunk above them, I do think is also pretty cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's all about that arrow through the neck for me. It's just super cool.
It is. It's one of the coolest deaths in the movie, especially once you know the story of how they were able to pull it off. It's just very, very cool. And it's definitely the most effective. It is pretty cool. So yeah, I mean, we talked about it. The process of showing the reveal in the body above him is also just very, very cool. So Cunningham is making some choices here, and he's putting in the work, and I think that definitely deserves some credit. These are definitely some of these I think stand up as some of the coolest deaths just in the franchise.
Yeah.
And even, I think we talked about it in Jason X. Jason X has one of the coolest kills in the franchise, too. Several of the coolest kills.
What's it called? Nitrogen, the liquid nitrogen death.
Nitrogen.
Yeah.
And also the smacking the girls against the
sleeping bag.
It's just hilarious. But yeah, so I think there's definitely some ideas here. Obviously, the franchise eventually becomes this kind of whole different beast. I mean, the dressings are kind of the same, but we ultimately get a very different killer that kind of does start using some very kind of specific methods. But I think these two kills, I think, are some of the best in the franchise. They definitely stand out.
I agree. And so thinking about hallmarks of the franchise and how much of it is not here. Jason as the killer, obviously not a concept yet. Jason wearing a hockey mask doesn't happen until part 3. Jason having the machete. I mean, part 2, I think he might use a pitchfork or an axe more. I mean,
I think he uses an axe.
The machete doesn't really come into play until much later, and he continues to use all kinds of different weapons. But it's amazing that, like, anytime you see, like, a parody of a slasher movie, it's a killer with a hockey mask, and it's teens at a campground. Even when they're not trying to specifically reference Friday the 13th, this franchise just becomes the de facto slasher, even though everything about it, #PP, is derivative. Like, nothing about the origin of this is particularly original, but it's the franchise that just doesn't die, that just persists, becomes a near annual tradition with how fast they start turning these things out, that it just bleeds into pop culture. You know a lot of the elements before you actually see the films. In fact, I did not watch these movies until 2021. I just remember it was like deep in the pandemic, or I guess I should say early in the pandemic, before there's a vaccine. I had to quarantine. I ended up not having it, but I had to quarantine because I was exposed. So I just was alone in this very room we're recording in for about a week. Maybe it was 5 days. At any rate, I was by myself in a room all day, and I was like, I'm going to watch this entire franchise. And I did. I probably watched all 10 movies in 3 days. It was a lot of fun. But it was just very fun to track when these different elements kind of come into play. And going back to this first one and how much of them are not here. But something that is here from the beginning, Andrew, is the iconic, I almost said iconic score. It's not even the score. It's just an element of the score. It's the which again becomes like the serial killer thing. But it's a hallmark of Friday the 13th. It happens like in the very, very, very beginning of this movie, whenever our voyeuristic camera from the point of view of the killer is stalking a couple of teenagers before they get killed. We hear that score, or that sound effect, which turns out to be, I don't have the name pulled up of the person who did the score, forgive me, but they talked about having this, I don't know if you call it instrument, this machine at the time that was like kind of cutting edge technology that allowed you to record a sample, which of course would become a big thing throughout the 80s. But they looked at the script, and specifically the part with the end with Pamela Voorhees saying, kill her, mommy. And they took those words as the sample. So it's actually key and ma from them saying, kill her, mommy. So it's key, ma. And that is so cool. Probably, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but one of the most artistic things this movie is doing. It's the very first time you see Pamela Voorhees killing someone, the score is the voice of Jason saying, kill her, mommy. Even though that's on such a subconscious level, you don't know that's what the score is saying until, you hear it in an interview or whatever.
Right.
But that's very cool for that haunting kind of thematic element to be there from the very first scene of the movie.
And so, shout out to Harry Manfredini, who does the score for this movie.
Thank you.
He is doing some good stuff. There's a lot of like Hitchcock Psycho, I feel like I'm hearing here when we're doing like the kills. We get that kind of very high pitched repeated noise when there's kills going on. There's a lot of different influences kind of happening with this score. But I do really, really like that piece of it. The kind of using the phrase "kill her, mommy" as this kind of like almost code that, like, when that starts happening, something's going to happen. And then that idea of like, it's become like a hallmark of just like hearing like faint noises, whatever, as a killer's approaching, or when it's too quiet or it's too dark and all that. And it's just cool. apparently part of that too was influenced by Jaws, just the idea that there was a musical motif that kind of ushered when the killer was nearby or a killer was coming. And yeah, it's just very well done.
And we're also setting something up here with this very first kill, where, again, we get the point of view, the camera is the point of view of the killer, which probably pretty new at the time. I mean, this is Evil Dead, something very similar in a few years, but I think it's a pretty good innovation of this, that voyeuristic camera, where we can kind of just tell whenever we're looking through the eyes of the killer. And we set up the mystery here where our killer is unseen, but there's another wrinkle where the teens that are about to get killed see the killer and aren't scared, you know? So we know it's not like a freaky mass killer or even a stranger. The kids are just like, they were making out and they're like, oh no, I promise we weren't doing anything. And they're not scared until the knife comes out and kills the first one. So we're already setting up from the very beginning, this is like a murder mystery type thing, which is not a hallmark of the series because it goes on to be, you know, very clearly Jason from the beginning to end, but it is something that's special about this first entry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no notes.
Yeah, it comes back most strongly towards the end. Like most of the kills, again, people are isolated when they get killed. They're not seeing the killer before they get killed. No one even knows this kill is happening until the very end, which is also very interesting because you think of slasher movies, you're always like, well, why don't they just run away? Oh, conveniently the car doesn't start or whatever. That doesn't happen here. No one knows they're getting picked off one by one because it all happens in one night, and it's not until the bodies literally start piling up and getting thrown at Alice that we even know there's a killer on the loose, which is interesting. But the whole thing about the killer not looking like a killer comes up again. Well, I guess, you know, whenever Annie is picked up by the driver, she's clearly not alarmed by the way they look. And then again, with Mr. Christie finally makes it back to camp, he recognizes the killer. He's like, oh, what are you doing out here? There's like a familiarity there. And then he gets killed. So it does such a good job setting it up. And I'm wondering if people, I mean, surely no one was guessing who the killer was because we know a kid drowned. We know there's 2 kills. So I guess there's enough evidence there to think that the mom might be killing. But the killer being a woman and being tied to his previous deaths, it's a nice little mystery in this movie for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And it just kind of flips it on its head because, you know, like even with Halloween, Michael is this unseen, or not unseen, but, you know, masked, face not seen, but he's clearly like a giant man. And so him going around being the one to pick people off makes sense. You're not shocked by it. With this, she kind of has to be more covert about it because she's not able to physically overpower these people.
As we see with Alice in the end.
Yes. Most of these deaths are she gets the jump on them, she sneaks up on them, she's largely and then the people that she is able to kind of overpower are the smaller people, like the woman in the woods. Like she's jumped out of the car, she's on the run, so she's able to get the jump on her pretty easily. Like Kevin Bacon is killed from under the bed. A lot of these characters, like obviously even though we don't see his death, the generator guy, he's arrowed to the wall, like so he's shot with a bunch of arrows.
I was about to ask you that. Was Bill standing in front of the door and she just shoots him from the woods and pins him to the door? Do you think that's what happened? Or do you think she walked up and stabbed arrows through him?
Yes.
Gotta be shooting him with an arrow.
Maybe the first one shot at him, pinned him to the door, and then she just stabbed the rest in.
Okay.
Who knows? But it is but I think that notion of they don't know is actually really important because like a lot of these movies, the hallmark is kind of that, you know, it's the kind of, and then there were none. There's a group of us, we've got nowhere to go, we're all dying, and we're all freaking out because we know it's happening. With this, they don't know it's happening. Everyone's like, oh, well, where's X, Y, and Z? It's like, who knows? They don't have any reason to think anything's going to be happening. If somebody runs off by themselves or a couple runs off by themselves, everyone just assumes they're boning. Like they don't assume the worst at this point. So as the people are dying, they have no idea. And then they kind of split and they're like, we'll all go to our rooms. We'll refresh in the morning. There's a storm. So everybody goes to their rooms. So nobody has any idea this is happening. It's actually genuinely a really interesting ripple because a lot of the later movies definitely do devolve into, oh crap, we're all being picked off and we've got to deal with this. So, I think that is an interesting part of the story here.
Another thing that I forget until I rewatch this movie or rewatch the original is Jason being set up as the future killer is kind of accidentally seeded pretty well. Because that was not, everyone who created this movie said that was not the plan, to continue this as a franchise, have Jason be the killer. They stumbled onto that when they tried to come up with the idea for part 2. But Tom Savini arguably deserves credit for Jason becoming a killer because he is responsible for the most important scene, I think, in this movie that sets it up, which is the last scare where Alice has killed Miss Voorhees. She goes out onto the lake in a little canoe to wait it out until the morning and falls asleep. When the police arrived, Jason jumps from the water and drags her under, but then she wakes up and it was a dream sequence, right? It's sort of this last scare. It's sort of establishing that even though it's a dream, maybe there's some evil in the water there. You know, there's an ominous final shot in the movie just staring at the water. She says, oh, the boy is still down there. This idea that the evil might still be alive. You know, between that and between Jason occupying part of Mrs. Voorhees' mind, she's speaking as Jason. She's clearly in her head. It's almost like when she's decapitated, the evil moves on to his body and resurrects him. I mean, honestly, the franchise never explains how Jason is suddenly the killer. But there's
how
enough.
He grew 6 feet in, a year.
Yeah, and that's another thing. I was a little confused about the timeline. It's 20 years, apparently, since he's drowned. But when you see him drag her under, he's still a little boy. But it's also a dream sequence, but also clearly there's more to it. I mean, look, there's no concrete explanation. It doesn't matter. Canon continuity is very loose in this franchise. But again, I think it's impressive how much groundwork is almost accidentally laid here. And again, Tom Savini is responsible. He came up with the idea for that final scare for Jason coming out. He designed the look of Jason. That was all him. Even though he gets no story or writing credits, he's responsible for that scene existing here, and it kind of becomes the linchpin for this to become a franchise. But to my knowledge, legally, he doesn't have like any rights or ownership, but I think he should probably, he deserves something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of wild when you look at things like this and you see that it wasn't intended to be this thing and it becomes this thing. I mean, Halloween was very similar. John Carpenter never had any bones about Halloween becoming this age-old horror franchise. If anything, like you said, he wanted it to be this anthology thing where every year there was a new Halloween, but it was a different standalone story. And he does see that through fruition a little bit with Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, which was kind of what he envisioned, is that a new writer-director would come in, or a particular writer-director would all come in, they tell their story, and then that's it. There was never going to be anything else. But Halloween 3 did so poorly, they were like, all right, bring back Michael Myers, and they did, and the rest is history. It is... So it's interesting that, like, even initially, the idea that little young Jason wasn't supposed to be at the end. It's crazy. It's crazy to think that there almost wasn't a seed for a future franchise. Not that I guess you needed it. You could have clearly just been like, oh, turns out Jason's alive and now he's the killer. Like, you could do that anytime. It did nothing stopping you. But to throw in that tease that you weren't going to do, anything with that you were then able to build off of, I think is an interesting ripple.
Yeah, Andrew, I enjoy this movie. I enjoy this franchise. I simultaneously understand critics of the time writing it off. I do think the film makes a few smart choices to differentiate it from the barrage of slashers at the time, but most slasher movies have some kind of hook to them, so you could probably find something to like in a lot of them if you're a fan of the genre, but like I get its reception. So I'm not going to like say critics maybe got it wrong. If it wasn't for them, this movie was not made for the 40-something-year-old movie critic at the time. It was made to draw kids into theater and make a profit, and it did, and the franchise continued to for a long time. We had a conversation before we hit record, where we were asking, if this movie is great. And I upped the ante. I said, is any movie in this franchise great? And I don't know that I really cherry pick any one of them to be like, well, look, if you like horror, if you like slashers, study this movie. But I also can't deny the entertainment factor, this entire franchise, this movie included. And I think even the fan base is generally in the same boat. Everyone has the handful they like more than others, their favorites, the ones they don't like as much. There's debate amongst that, but like, I don't know if anybody would look at these movies as like high art or particularly creative, but there seems to be an agreement that they are just entertaining.
Agreed. It is it's an interesting thing because, you talk about, critics not getting something, and I'm not going to say that they didn't not get this. I just clearly, I'm sure when Sean Cunningham was conceiving of this movie with Victor Miller, the last thing he was thinking about is, I wonder what Roger Ebert's going to think about this. Like, I'm sure that wasn't on his mind, or wonder what Siskel and Ebert are going to talk about with this. And yeah. I just, that's not something on their minds. And, getting great critical reception is great. But at the same time, they just wanted to make a successful franchise. And in that regard, or successful film. And in that regard, it succeeded. In spades, no less. So, it is an odd thing, but, yeah, it's fundamental to this franchise. And there is definitely pieces of, just the slasher genre that kind of do form here. Obviously, Halloween by many is seen as kind of the first slasher film, even though there's some earlier stuff that kind of gets some attention. Even stuff like Psycho or Peeping Tom kind of gets some attention for movies that are like putting you in the point of view of the killer, movies that are kind of slasher, proto-slashers. And Halloween obviously is the one that's conceived of as like the first kind of distillation of all those concepts into one movie. But there's stuff I think Friday the 13th is doing that makes it unique and makes it interesting and worth watching.
Andrew, summer camp month has begun. 1 down, 3 to go. Did you ever attend a summer camp as a child? Was this ever part of your life?
I did go to, I was in the Boy Scouts for a while, Cub Scouts. Okay. So I did a Boy Scout summer camp for a week one summer. Did that. Did another couple of like Boy Scout campouts. But yeah, I did a full on summer camp with the Boy Scouts one summer. I hated it.
I was never in the Scouts. I
never finished. I'm not like an Eagle Scout or anything. Don't get any ideas.
Okay. You sound like you'd be embarrassed to be an Eagle Scout, Andrew.
I mean, my dad was an Eagle Scout, but the organization these days is a little questionable.
Well, sure. But you can learn some valuable skills.
Like Andrew, tying knots.
I never did anything summer camp related. To me, this was like, I just assumed these things didn't exist anymore by the time I was growing up in the 90s. It's very much a movie thing for me, because you see summer camps in movies all the time, and they always make it look like school's out, parents drop you off, you're there for 3 months, and then they pick you up. It's always like,
yeah.
And there's like this whole like society with cabins and camp leaders and kids going crazy. I don't know. I never did anything like that. Like I said, and I'm sure this, even though they were in real life, I'm sure the version I'm used to in the movies is definitely a heightened version of what was actually happening. But I never did the summer camp thing. Maybe like some vacation Bible schools, probably the closest I did that was ever anything close to this. But never stayed on like a campgrounds without parents or whatever.
Yeah. It's interesting because I didn't really like being the outdoors. I didn't really enjoy like sleeping on a plank of wood with 4 canvas walls. I didn't see that as a good. I never stayed in like a summer camp where it was like cabins or anything. I always stayed in ones where it was like tents. Now my sister has spent many a year working at the Girl Scout summer camps up towards Conroe, which is a city you're familiar with.
Yes.
But not necessarily our listeners. It's about 30 miles north of Houston. And that is like cabins and stuff. And so she worked there for a great many summers. But like, yeah, it's always wild to me that like movies portray summer camps as like literally you go for like 2 months. Yeah. And like for me, like every summer camp I ever saw, you were there for like a week. Like you were not there for that long. And maybe there are. I guess maybe that's like sleepaway camps. Even then, like I don't know. Like I mean, we're not doing sleepaway camp this month, which I guess we could have. But it's they even always present it as like, you know, movies like Wet Hot American Summer. They're like at the beginning of the summer and they're there all the way to the end. It's like, is this a thing? Like, is there a campground where literally they're just letting 60 kids hang out there for 3 months? Like, I guess so.
Well, we will continue to discuss the concept of summer camps throughout the month. I mean, this movie we covered today, Friday the 13th, never gets to the point where there's campers on the campground. But I think the rest of the movies...
It doesn't, does it?
We will get there. Yeah, there's never actually an active camp here. I guess the very beginning when the 2 kids get killed, maybe. But even then, we just see the camp counselors. Kind of interesting there. But
yeah.
We'll continue to explore the concept. But for now, Andrew, it's time for our question of the week. And if you want to leave us a question for a future episode, you can do exactly that by joining our Discord server. There's a link right there in the show notes of the podcast. You just click on it and you're in. That's it. No paywall, no Patreon, nothing like that. Just join the community, hang out with us, talk about nerdy things, play some daily movie games with us, and leave a question if you are so inclined, just like friend of the show and sweetheart of podcasting himself, Bob Buell, has done. And I thought this question would be appropriate considering our opening conversation of this episode. He says, simple question for you gents. Best documentary ever? Question mark. Now, Bob, you say this is a simple question, but here's the thing. You did not say favorite documentary, which I think is a simple question. You said best documentary, which makes this much, much tougher. And in that light, nothing immediately springs to mind for me. But Andrew, what do you think? Do you have an answer for this offhand? Best documentary ever?
Ken Burns is the name that comes to mind. All the documentaries that he did about like the Civil War and various things, like those are the ones that immediately come to mind as far as like the best documentaries, because a documentary is not inherently just a film. There can be a documentary series that's like 8 episodes. Sure, Ken Burns is kind of notorious for those. And like, if you're asking me what the best ones are, probably something Ken Burns has done.
And where I don't know much about Ken Burns' actual documentaries, except there is a pan named after the Ken Burns effect of like basically like a still photograph. You start here, a few seconds pass, and then it slides over to a different part of the photograph. It's called Ken Burns. So
yeah,
there's that.
But he did. But he's done a bunch of them. The Civil War is probably one of the best ones he's done. But he's done all sorts of things. He's done ones on baseball. He's done one on the national parks. He's done stuff on the Dust Bowl. He did one on the Vietnam War a couple of years ago. Like, he's done tons of stuff. But if I was going to pick one, Ken Burns' The Civil War is probably up there.
Okay. I don't know. Documentaries have definitely changed in recent years. I would say the past 20, 25 years or so. They've become much more narrative focused and much more like a film, for better or worse. Some of my favorite documentaries do have a narrative element to it, but that's just because I love storytelling and I love movies, and it doesn't necessarily make it a good documentary, because the more you focus on the narrative, the more you kind of manufacture that story, the less you're concerned with telling the facts, which should be the purpose of a documentary. Most good documentaries are going to be a little dry. You got to have some interest in the source material for sure, I think, to really come in and appreciate what it's doing. I remember seeing this documentary called Crosswords in theaters. I saw it at this theater. It's not there anymore. It's called the Angelica in downtown Houston, which I loved going to because they got like limited release movies and movies that are typically only in like New York and LA that come through there or whatever. You could see a lot of cool stuff there. I saw The Fountain there. I saw I'm Not There, the Bob Dylan biopic. It's one of my favorites. But in any case, I would just go there, see what's playing because it's not playing anywhere else. And I saw this crossword documentary. Pretty good. Some stuff has really stayed with me. But again, it's not narrative focused. It's not following a specific crossword tournament and you're following these wacky characters as they make their way through. It's just a bunch of people talking about how much they love the New York crossword. I remember Jon Stewart is interviewed. He shows up a few times. But there's, again, kind of this line, like the late 90s, early 2000s, where like they started being more narrative focused and started getting more attention at award season, become more profitable, and it really changed documentaries. You start getting things like Searching for Sugar Man, which, great documentary, I really enjoy it, but you start running into that thing where it's not about giving you all the facts, it's about telling an interesting story with real life people and footage, so it changes kind of what a documentary is. But despite all that rambling, I cannot tell you what the best documentary is. I'm not the person for that. I'm going to lean more towards my favorite documentary, and the first one that comes to mind is King of Kong, Fistful of Quarters, the documentary about Steve Wiebe trying to gain the world record for high score in Donkey Kong. It's fantastic. It's crazy entertaining. Lots of great characters. It is, again, narrative focused. It's got a perfect villain in Billy Mitchell.
Did it turn out Mitchell faked all this stuff anyway?
Well, Andrew, I'm not going to spoil the documentary, but there's...
Oh, I thought this was revealed later. I thought this wasn't in the documentary.
Oh, much more stuff has come out about it. Sure, yeah. The biggest controversy in the documentary is that, like, Twin Galaxies, who at the time was seen as, like, the mecca of high scores, record keeping, did not allow recorded footage. You had to perform it live with a witness. But suddenly for Billy Mitchell, they allowed him to submit this VHS that had like a little bit of, what do you call that? Feedback, static. Not a perfect quality VHS, but they allowed it to be submitted for high score. It's a great doc if you haven't watched it. It hits all the pitfalls I was just talking about being narrative focused, but great characters, very entertaining. Probably my personal favorite.
I do really like, I mean, I'm a wrestling fan. Beyond the Mat was something foundational that I saw way back when I was a kid, as far as just kind of getting a greater insight into the wrestling industry and kind of what it means and how it was. That one is really...
For our generation, that's probably like our first taste of true behind the scenes.
Yeah.
You know, what's really going on.
And nowadays, WWE makes their own documentaries, many of which are very, very good. One I'm going to recommend, and if you've not heard about this one, I'm not going to tell you anything about it, except kind of the short film of it. But it is a movie called Icarus. It's a documentary called Icarus. It is narrative focused. It's from a few years ago, but it is an attempt by the documentarian making it, Brian Fogel, to expose the inadequacy of the kind of processes used to identify athletes using illegal substances. That is the offset and the kind of original concept that he entered into making this documentary with, and he discovers a heck of a lot more than that. And I really don't want to say too much about it, but it is tremendous. It is very, very good. And that does tend to be kind of my favorite documentaries, where there's this core thing, and it kind of blows up into this much bigger thing.
Okay, Icarus. I will check it out. I feel like we're obligated to mention An Inconvenient Truth. We're talking about best documentary ever. I've never watched it. I'm sure it's good. It's got an important message. I feel like it instantly became a punchline, though.
It did. Man, Bear, Pig. I mean, I'm super serial, guys. Like, it's literally, Al Gore made a documentary talking about how we basically need to watch it and take care of the environment. And we all made fun of him for it. And it's one of those things where, like, there's this comedian I really like. His name is Joe Pera, and he released a stand-up special on YouTube a couple years ago. Very, very funny, free to watch. But he talked about how he looks back at points in history and wonders if that's where we went wrong. And he pointed to William Hung on American Idol, and everyone just relentlessly mocking this man who was trying to do something that he loved. And he just looks at that and just wonders that if we were nicer to William Hung, maybe the Sopranos movie would have been better. Basically, we, after how we treated that man, we deserve a perfectly generic, okay Sopranos movie. So you got to wonder if something like An Inconvenient Truth is similar, where we made like literally, like if you look at that concept, it's like, and you kind of. It's one of those things I look back at and I'm like, it seems odd that mockery was the like almost gut check response to that instead of even a remote moment of introspection.
Man, I have reflected on so much stuff from like big news things from my childhood and thought about the big reaction to it. And there's a podcast series I listen to called Not Past It about these historical events that has been part of me kind of reevaluating a lot of them. But like Paris Hilton having a sex tape leak, and the reaction is to make her the butt of the jokes when she's the victim of a serious crime, or Britney Spears shaving her head, and that's a punchline for late night comedians. It's like people in the spotlight, in trouble, in danger, going through something, but we make them the butt of the joke rather than like, hey, this isn't right. Like, let's help this person. It's wild.
Like Britney Spears, a great example, is we like publicly watched her meltdown.
Yeah.
Like literally just broadcast for the world to see. And the joke was to mock that woman and not the system that put her in that position. You look at the sex tapes, and that's a great example of like the woman is almost always the butt of the joke with the sex tapes, even though there's literally somebody else in that video, and the woman is almost never the one who releases it, which means that it's literally done against their consent, and
someone profiting off of their, it's horrible.
And the gut check response is, oh, well, you shouldn't have shot it then. And it's like, no, you have a right to privacy. Like, you shouldn't just say the minute you record something, you give up or you accept that it's going to be seen by somebody. That's not how it's supposed to work.
Before we wrap it up on documentaries, I want to shout out the documentary Food Inc. I'm trying to go back to like non-narrative documentaries that I consider a very important documentary. Definitely had an impact on me, and was part of the reason I stopped eating fast food. Haven't had fast food in over a decade now. And then just looking at my letterbox, I also watched, I mentioned the documentaries I watched on the plane, but I also recently watched the documentary The Sweatbox, which is about, specifically, I guess, Sting the musician, his part in the making of The Emperor's New Groove. Which, if you're thinking, like, what does Sting have to do with that? Well, he has a song in the closing credits, but he was supposed to be, like, a big creative force, much like, what's the Genesis guy that did Tarzan? What's his name, Andrew?
Phil Collins.
Yeah, it's something at that level. Or Elton John doing Lion King. That's how it started. It was a totally different movie called, what's it called? Empire of the Sun, I think it was called. And it was about like Peru, and it was the like Tale of Two Cities thing, and Owen Wilson was cast. This documentary follows the morphing of that movie from what it began as to what it is, and captures in a very intimate way Disney's animated creative process at the time, which they still use something very similar, where it's like the animators and writers develop the story and concept, everything simultaneously. They put together a rough cut, and then producers of Disney come and watch it and give it the axe or change it and give, the influence. And that viewing room is nicknamed the Sweatbox, which is where the title of the documentary comes from. What's interesting about this thing is it's created by Sting's wife, who was a documentary filmmaker, and who Disney allowed to make this documentary as part of the whole contract for bringing in Sting to do the music, but because of the tumultuous process, Disney does not come out looking very good in this documentary. But they own the documentary technically, and a version of it was released as a special feature for Emperor's New Groove, but heavily edited and doesn't really tell the full story. Years later, someone leaked the actual documentary. It's never been officially released, but you can find it. I found it. You don't even have to go to too shady of a website to find it. I was able to find a copy pretty easily and add it to my Plex. You'll know you've got the right thing because the timestamp is literally burned into the documentary. It's running there the entire time you watch it. But fascinating look at Disney's process. And again, they don't come out looking too great. But as someone that certainly loves like animation and is fascinated with the process, I really enjoyed that documentary. So highly recommend that one.
Another one I'll throw out is Wrestling with Shadows. I don't know if you've ever seen that one.
Oh,
The Bret Hart documentary that WWE apparently literally was letting a documentary crew film and do interviews with Bret Hart leading up to the Montreal Screwjob. Which is one of those things where you definitely stop for a moment and be like, well, that was awful convenient.
I'd say the conspiracy theorists who say that the screw job was actually all work and Bret was in on it would cite this documentary as a reason for it. But I don't personally buy into that. I think it was sort of luck, but yeah.
Yeah, and so apparently after they shot it, Vince kind of gave him a little bit of trouble over whether he's going to release it, because Vince was like, I'm not going to come off very well in here. WCW apparently came in and offered to pay all the associated legal fees and offered them a pay-per-view slot to release it. And then Vince came through after the WCW offer, supposedly, and basically was like, fine, whatever, we'll honor the original deal, whatever. Basically, the documentary filmmakers still assert that Vince kind of held the movie back wherever he could while still letting it be released. But that's another one that I remember watching and just was shocked at how much. I'm like, even now, I don't believe it was necessarily an inside job, but it is definitely odd that you would still do it knowing that he's being followed by a documentary crew the whole time.
Yeah.
Someone looks bad or someone looks kind of dumb. I won't necessarily say who it is, but that's what it is.
Yeah. Well, does that answer the question, Bob? The greatest documentary ever? I'm sure we named it. We named a lot of documentaries. I do enjoy docs, but I'm really curious. I can't say I've watched too many. I've probably already named half the documentaries I've ever watched. So if you have recommendations out there, or if you have strong feelings about what the best documentary is, what your favorite is, we certainly want to know about it. Let us know in the Discord, the one I talked about earlier. There's a link in the show notes. Come on, join us, do it, and come back next week for Ernest Goes to Camp, our second Ernest movie on the podcast. And just remember, maybe not every movie is great,
but all movies have greatness.
Thank you to Mark Benavides for singing our theme song. Follow him on Instagram at NotThatMarkAnthony. And thanks to Mitch for the music. You can check him out on Twitter at I'm a Biggie Boy, and check our show notes for the SoundCloud link. Check out our store on TeePublic for some Best of the Rest merch. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. That's the only way that we grow. And follow us on social media at BOTRcast. Thank you.
I like going to Whole Foods or a thing like that if I can, but they're just out of the way. They're not around. But Jewel Osco is the big chain up here.
How's it compared to H-E-B?
It doesn't. And then there's we have some Amazon Fresh, those ones that popped up that are the light Whole Foods. And then there's Whole Foods. There's another one called Pete's Fresh Market. That's the one I actually like the most, but they're just not everywhere near my house. But Jewel Osco is the chain. But yeah, I went to H-E-B when I was in Texas. I was like, yeah, there's no comparison here. There's none. Not at all.